Okay, welcome back. Chapter 3, American Federalism. Again, we're walking through my lecture notes to condense down the amount of note taking you have to take, and you can focus on learning. So, as we've learned in previous chapters, American Federalism seeks to balance the forces of decentralization and centralization. If you recall, we had two parties, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalist. Um, Federalists were very much in favor of a more powerful central government. Anti-federalists were looking for the power to be disseminated to the states, um, and so that back and forth continues. Some examples of decentralization, meaning not a centralized power, are things like different laws across state lines, taxation levels that vary, different taxation models. You have states that actually don't have an income tax. You have states that do have a significant income tax. You have states that have varying sales taxes. They also have varying welfare eligibility requirements. Things like Medicare are administered on a national level, but things like Medicaid are administered on a state level, and we'll get into healthcare here in a second. Different states have different voting methodologies and practices. For example, Iowa has caucuses, basically town halls, caucuses where they vote. Other states have primaries. When it comes to national elections, it's pretty uniform. When it comes to local elections, when it comes to primaries for national elections, they're very different. Examples of centralization, meaning central power. Only the federal government can print money, at least legally, and the feds can challenge the legality of state laws in the courts. And feds often employ grants, so they offer money basically for states to do certain behaviors. So if you want to start a entrepreneurship program for minority business owners, the national government may offer a pool of grants that state and local governments can apply for to make that action happen. There are also mandates that the federal government can give to states that will shape states' actions. A lot of times they try to do it with money first and then mandates second, but we see a little bit of everything. If you pay close enough attention in the news, you will see examples of centralization with the federal government using grants and mandates to shape state behaviors. So this chapter is really broken down in a few sections. The first one is the division of powers. So federalism is an institutional arrangement that creates two relatively autonomous levels of government. So you basically have the national government and then the state level government. And then under the state level, like kind of a sub-government or local municipalities, school districts, that type of thing. So in the big picture, we have two governments. We have state and local. Each possesses the capacity to act directly on behalf of the people with the authority granted to them by the national constitution. So federalism is written into our constitution, states' rights. The interpretation of the Constitution has changed over time. But in general, there are really 5 characteristics of federalism. And this isn't necessarily just American federalism. Mexico has federalism. Germany, many European countries have federalism. So all have these 5 characteristics of federalism. All have 2 levels of elected officials serving different functions. The 2 levels, generally speaking, are some sort of national government, some sort of state or regional government. States or deal with regional and local issues, and national governments deal with countrywide issues, things like national defense. The second characteristic of federalism is a written national constitution. It's a statement of rights and organization of the government. Third is legislative, judicial, and executive authority. So basically 3 branches of government are allocated across both levels. Now, a lot of times when people hear, hey, 3 branches of government, you think of like, hey, the White House, the Supreme Court, and Congress. What you have to keep in mind is it's being recorded in South Carolina. The state of South Carolina has a governor, executive. They have local, state, and federal courts. There's your judiciary. And they have a state legislature with a House and a state Senate. So you see that across both levels. Fourthly, national courts in federalism resolve dispute among and between levels of government. So if you have two government agencies, one says a state versus another state, or state versus the federal government, or some business operating across states, you need kind of an overarching court system to take care of that, and that's what the national courts are for. And it can appeal all the way to the Supreme Court. But just because you appeal to the Supreme Court doesn't mean that the Supreme Court will hear your case. You have to first be put on the docket, and so that's a decision they make as well. So you have all these, the fifth characteristic of federalism, regardless of where it is you have sub-governments, basically. So they're represented in the national legislature. So, for example, South Carolina is a sub-government of the national government. Spartanburg County is a sub-government of the state government. Both in the state house and in the U.S. Senate and U.S. House of Representatives, we're all represented. These sub-governments are represented. So there is a local representative in the U.S. House of Representatives that represents the area populace. And then in the U.S. Senate, each state has two senators, so they represent the territory. So sub-governments have a voice through elected officials. The chapter continues with a further delineation of different types of systems: Unitary, Federation, and Confederation. If you recall from the previous chapter, we actually started out as a Confederation, and in the Articles of Confederation, the authority is concentrated in the states. That was the United States under the Articles of Confederation. If you look at a unitary system, you basically have a national government that just dictates down to the states. So in the Confederation, we had the states dictating to the national governments. In a unitary system, you have national governments dictating to the states. So the authority is concentrated in central government. So these are actually things like the United Kingdom has a largely unitary system. Japan and Sweden are examples of national government top-down. Confederation was the U.S. Back early post-revolution, states dictating to national government. Post and during revolution, I guess you'd say. But the Constitution, as it evolved over time, basically made it a federation. Listen, the people elect people to state governments and national governments, and authority is divided between the central and state governments, and is derived from the people. So examples of this in modern-day governments are Canada, India, the United States under the Constitution. Just breaking down powers here: federal government on the left, state government on the right, kind of where they meet in the middle. Federal government does things like, hey, coin money, print money, create money, deal with foreign affairs. They have a Supreme Court, the ultimate court you appeal to, declare war on behalf of all the states, on behalf of all the country. Powers that they are, so that's the powers they have, powers that they deny. They can't tax state exports, so they can't say, hey, we're going to put a tax on some crop produced in South Carolina. They can't do that. They can't change the state boundaries. That's between the states. And they can't violate the Bill of Rights. That's the biggest thing that the Anti-Federalists got in with the first 10 amendments were the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. Things that state powers have reserved powers to do. They can regulate their own interstate commerce, intrastate, so commerce within their state, and then negotiate between states. They conduct their own elections. That's why we see varying different practices in elections. Different states do things different ways. They provide public health, safety, welfare, and morals. They oversee Medicare, but that's federally funded. They actually fund Medicaid. We said earlier we talk a little bit more on healthcare. I'll take a moment here. Medicare generally is for older folks, 65 and older, and sometimes the legally declared disabled can be covered by Medicare. And again, it's nationally funded, national program. Medicaid is state-run. Medicaid is what we call indigent health care. So if you're in a poverty situation where you can't afford your own health care, you might be eligible for Medicaid. Medicare and Medicaid's both meant to be what we call a safety net. And the idea is that people fall into the safety net, although in modern day terms we have some people jumping into the safety net. But it's meant to provide that better outcome, potential safety net for people. So state government can also establish local governments. They can recognize local municipalities. They oversee the National Guard, which is our modern day version of your state militia. and then they can propose and ratify amendments to the Constitution. Some powers that are denied. They can't tax imports and exports. So South Carolina can't put an extra tax on a ship coming into Charleston in international trade. They can't coin their own money. They can't enter into treaties. Like South Carolina and Sweden can't enter into a treaty. They can enter into a trade agreement if they like, but not a treaty. That's a national thing. And they can't deny due process. Although Lord knows in the past they've tried. And they have to provide equal protection under laws because that's under the umbrella of the federal government. So some things that they do together, both federal and state governments, is they levy and collect taxes. Now, generally speaking, the main tax for the federal government is the federal income tax. And the main tax for state and local governments, for state, you can still say the income tax. However, local governments are very much more dependent upon both the sales tax and the property tax. So your local county, town, everything is very much sales tax and property tax. Excuse me. So they both can tax. They both can borrow money. They both can establish courts. They can take property for public purposes. And boy, that gets sticky when we talk about eminent domain. Just a little bit of divide of shared powers there, and then some things the federal government can do and can't do, and some things that the state government can and cannot do. This is actually an interesting read in the textbook, so please make sure you're doing the reading there because you can learn a whole lot more in the reading than you can in this one thing. One topic I thought I'd cover here is the Constitution, Article 1, Section 9 prevents the deprivation, means taking away of personal liberty. This means that the government on any level cannot suspend what's called the writ of habeas corpus, which enables someone in custody to petition a judge to determine whether the person's detention is legal and ensures a fair trial. It's also reaffirmed in the Bill of Rights. So habeas corpus is incredibly important, preserving a free society. Going back to the Revolution, where we'd have England just basically detaining colonists and sending them to Europe, sending them, to England for trial, and they're never heard from again. They had no rights. You have rights. Be reasonable. I'm certainly not advocating being obstinate if you're stopped and questioned, but you do have the right to say, am I being detained under Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution? And if you're not being detained, you are free to go. That's what the Constitution says. So keep that in mind. And I have a note here for you to review the financial breakdown of federal and state budgets. I don't go into it here in great detail, but I can tell you it's on the quiz. You need to know kind of where the federal spends its money and gets its money, where the state spends its money and gets its money. Federal government typically runs what we call a deficit, meaning we're in debt. We have a spending problem. Problem is, you elect a bunch of people. They have fun spending other people's money. But this is not that class. If you want that class, take macroeconomics. I teach that as well. So the second section is the evolution of American federalism. Basically, I try to put this together as a timeline. It gets a little dense in the reading. Certainly need to do the reading. But 1789, 1795, he has back and forth between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton is the Secretary of the Treasury. Jefferson is the Secretary of State. Hamilton was a big proponent of a national central bank. So like an overarching bank, like the bank's bank. Jefferson strongly opposed the central bank on constitutional grounds, and he also felt like a central bank would have too much influence. I mean, money is influence. And so if you're put all this power in one spot, it's easily influenced. So like special interests can come in there and influence it. And there's an argument to this day, we actually have a central bank. It's called the Federal Reserve, that they should be audited and we should know what's going on there. And I can't really argue against that, both as a political science guy and economist, really more of a political economist. I can't really argue against that. I see his point. But I also see Hamilton's point in that you need somebody to oversee the system, and if the economy gets in trouble, somebody to be that place where the buck stops. So initially, Hamilton prevailed and created the first national bank of the United States. But then Jefferson became president. Hamilton met an undesirable demise, as we all know. And Jefferson let the bank's charter expire in 1811, so it essentially went away. But then Jefferson's fellow Virginian, James Madison, around 1816, became president, and Congress created a second national bank of the U.S. Now, Madison wasn't really for it, but if you know anything about history, the War of 1812, we went at it with the British again, darn near lost. They burned Washington. And we're kind of lucky to get out of that alive, and we were in debt. And so the central bank was needed again, so they created the second national bank of the U.S. Interesting happenings in the subsequent years was Maryland then taxed the second bank, saying it was unconstitutional. So they set up these regional banks of the second bank, and Maryland said, guess what? We're going to slap a tax on you because we don't believe you should exist. That battle went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they eventually ruled that Second National Bank was constitutional and a duty of the United States to provide. This ruling was Mcculloch versus Maryland. Maryland obviously was the plaintiff, or excuse me, the defendant, who levied a tax on the second bank. Mcculloch was the representative of the second bank. So that established, basically, that kind of set the tracks. They didn't know it at the time, for Congress to be a more legitimate national force, because it told a state what it had to do. And it was backed up by the Supreme Court. So then you had the legislative and judiciary branch saying, you know what, this central power needs more power. So that kind of set the tone, and that was way back in like the 1800s. So in the 1860s, we were dealing with something called nullification, which says that states had the right to reject national laws they deem unconstitutional. We're starting to approach the Civil War, the ultimate kind of head-to-head battle of states' rights versus federalism, which obviously sadly ended in the Civil War. One of the issues, certainly one of the key issues states were looking nullification to do is they were growing support. I mean, there was growing support back in the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson originally had written to free men, meaning humans, regardless of color, too. And so we're like almost 100 years later, and that battle's still being fought. So slavery was a huge issue heading into, during, and after the Civil War. And basically nullification says, hey, states can ignore national laws. Now, certainly, when you have something as deplorable as slavery, nullification seems like a bad thing. But if you had a federal government that's trying to hand down other laws outside of slavery, they're saying, you must do this, you must do this, you can't have free speech or anything. Certainly a state would be in its right to nullify. So this went back and forth. I mean, from the 1820s through the Civil War. At the end of the Civil War, we had the 13th, 14th, 15th amendments, which ended the Civil War and freed the slaves, and gave slaves the right to vote, at least the male slaves. The Union victory ended the states' rights to succeed. So you could no longer say, you know what, I don't like what's going on in the Union, I'm leaving. You can't do that anymore. The post-Civil War balance of power tilted mightily towards the federal government, and nullification was minimized. So states had less of a voice. They could be less rebellious. They had to more or less comply. So this led to an age of dual federalism, where national and state governments operate in different spheres. So states do it more local and regional. National government takes care of all the big stuff. So that basically put to bed the Articles of the Confederation. So almost 100 years later. Then the 1930s, Cooperative Federalism emerged out of the Great Depression. Great Depression, man, you just had, and this is pre-World War II, so you had incredible unemployment, incredible poverty. I mean, just you know, I apologize, but I don't have the statistic right in my head, but, you know, several out of 5 were living in poverty and, you know, losing their homes and that type of thing. So we had real problems. So the nation needed help due to widespread economic hardships. Both levels acted to solve national problems. So cooperative federalism is states. So you kind of coming out of the Civil War, we kind of hate states versus the Union. In the 1930s, it kind of turned around. So, you know, seven decades later, to where, look, we got to work together to keep our people from starving to come out of this. And that only grew through World War II. And then we get to the 70s, and the central government started to decentralize a little bit, and this is known as New Federalism. So the reason why you might want to decentralize government a little bit is, number one, it's somewhat peaceful, although we're about to enter the Cold War here. is somewhat peaceful, actually, in the Cold War. Somewhat peaceful. There's not a great need for a huge, powerful government. Definitely need powerful national defense when you're in the Civil War, in the Cold War era. But governments are hard to administer in a large country like the U.S. when you try to do everything from top down. So it started to move to, hey, let's empower local governments. Let's fund them. Let's let them take care of education. Reason being that was an improved performance and at lower costs. Now, generally speaking, we feel like we kind of have a mix of both of these things. I think when you get in the 2000s, with the emergence of terrorism, we've kind of, I think, shifted more towards, hey, national defense is not just somewhere over there now. It's here as well. So yeah, things like Homeland Security, the Patriot Act emerge. Generally speaking, as a policy guy, if something's called the Patriots Act, Patriot Act, generally speaking, patriots won't like it. Patriot Act actually gave the government a lot of freedom to spy on you. If you've got an iPhone right now, hi, how you doing? Yeah, NSA, I'm talking to you. So there's a lot of back and forth still between states and national government. Certainly keeping people safe from terrorism is a role for government. But one of the things I wanted to add here, it's not actually in your book, but I just want to add this because I think this kind of stuff is cool. So know your rights. While state nullification of federal laws have been largely marginalized, they've been minimized, marginalized, kind of put to the side, jury nullification remains to this day. I should have capitalized that right there, but you know what? They're notes, so I'm putting these together. When members of a criminal trial jury believe that a defendant is guilty, but they choose to acquit the defendant anyway because the jurors considered the law itself unjust, that the prosecutors misapplied the law in a defendant's case, or that potential punishment is breaking the law is too harsh, they can just ignore the law. Which is kind of cool. It's kind of scary, kind of cool. I mean, you have to get all jurors to agree that. I'm trying to think of a situation. Let's say, I'm trying to think of all the situations I think of are horrible, but it feels like it's justified. Let's say someone is assaulted, victim of a sexual assault. And in the process of being assaulted, they kill their assailant. Now, I think most of us would say that's defense, that's justified, right? What if for some reason some state prosecutor or something decided to charge that person with murder? Did they technically kill that person? Yes. But is a murder charge warranted? So if that charge came to a jury and it went to trial, I think we could all agree that was a justified killing. But they're being charged with murder, which they technically did kill someone. But dude had it coming, right? All right. You as a juror can find them not guilty via jury nullification. So that's something that gets minimized in today's society for some dumb reason. But I wanted you to be aware that jury nullification is a thing. So keep that in mind. By the way, if you get summoned for a jury, the natural inclination is, crap, man, I don't want to serve on this jury. And most people try to get out of it. And, this might be a situation where you need to get out of it. You get work, you lose your job, you're taking care of somebody. That's okay. That's okay. But if at all possible, you can serve on that jury, please do it. We need reasonable people on juries. I'm sitting here trying to educate you guys. And if you're learning, if you're putting in the work, and something happens to me, I want you on my jury, all right? I don't want a bunch of just people who are, all they do is play Fortnite. I don't know. I want some people who are well-read, who might, give me some jury nullification if I need it. All right. Part 3 of the chapter, Intergovernmental Relationships, kind of a shorter section. This is where we talk about the grants. Grants are basically money that can be used to influence states' actions. Like, hey, South Carolina, if you do this, we'll give you this. That's federal government to the state. There are 2 different types of grants. Categorical grants are federal transfers formulated to limit recipients' discretionary use of the funds. If you want to get a grant to get a state to do one thing, you might need to provide some oversight to make sure that money is spent on the right things. A strict way of doing that, if it's a more serious situation, like, hey, feeding kids, you might make that a categorical grant. with oversight to make sure the money is all going to feed kids. The second type is a block grant. These are less stringent and more flexible, i.e., hey man, just take this money, create a job skill program, improve your highways. We're not gonna be breathing down your neck the whole time, making sure you're doing what we're just gonna trust you. So more broad type things. In my experience, I don't have any stats to back this up, but my experience, I've seen way more block grants than I have categorical grants, because categorical grants have a high administrative cost in that you have to oversee them. There's basically, you have to employ somebody to watch every dime. Block grants tend to be, while there's some abuse within block grants tend to be a little more, well, there's more freedom for sure, but a little more prevalent. Sometimes there's things called unfunded mandates. When the federal government requires a state to implement a policy or system, they require it legally, but then they don't give them any money to do it. So it doesn't really actually happen. These are largely political. Things like the Clean Air Act. People get elected on the environment and they say, hey, Clean Air Act, we want to clean up, we want to reduce emissions by 20% by 2030. But then they don't give a plan. The federal government says, hey, South Carolina do this. They don't tell them how. They don't give them any money. So do you think it gets done? No. So it's an unfunded mandate. It's usually generally something pretty good, like, hey, let's clean up the air. But then they don't really execute a plan. So it's like, hey, you should do this. And I'm like, sure. So it may or may not get done. Competitive Federalism is the next section, probably the shortest. But probably, if we had more time to discuss, probably the most contentious. The contentious issues in the Federalist system, things like immigration, marriage rights, religious liberty, abortion, you could just keep going, right? These contentious debates have led to attempts to affect policy on behalf of interest groups and lobbyists. The reason why it's kind of condensed here is we will spend a whole chapter 10, on special interest groups and lobbying and the effect they have on the American system of government. So we'll spend some more time there. We'll have hopefully some spirited debates by then. Respectful but spirited. So lastly, we wrap up with the advantages and disadvantages of federalism. Some federalism benefits here is it promotes policy innovation, political participation, as well as diversity of opinion. You have states that are trying things out. So you got California trying to do one thing, South Carolina trying to do another thing. And then from national level, you can step back and say, hey, what worked, what didn't work? So really, federalism is best described as a policy laboratory where states can try out new policies as an experiment. And if they're effective, then those policies can be adopted nationally. The worst thing you want to do is adopt a policy nationally, and it's just a terrible policy, and it screws everybody up. So you can look and see these 50 different states that you can try things, and then you can look to the world as well, because there's a lot of federalism out there, and see what's working and what's not, and adopt the good things and don't adopt the bad. So with two levels of governments, individuals, groups, and social movements have plenty of ways to impact policy locally, regionally, and nationally. So you've got a lot of entry points that get involved. A lot of people say, hey man, I don't know where to start. I would just say, just start. You'll find your way. There's plenty you can do. So constitutionally, there are checks and balances in place to prevent the federal government or any part of the government from imposing uniform regulations nationally. States can push back. States and local governments have the leeway to address their citizens' problems as they best see fit. So something that might work as a solution in South Carolina doesn't work in Nevada or Oregon or New York. These issues include things like abortion, drinking age, gun control, social welfare benefits. So that kind of doubles back to competitive federalism today. You have two sides on a heated debate, and they both want it their way. Generally speaking, politics and political science is compromise, is conversation. So federalism, so basically going back to that last point, I'm sorry. Things like gun control. Some people might say, hey, we need these reasonable controls, and other people say, no way, man. Second Amendment all the way. Generally speaking, neither side can get absolute victory. So that's the check on power between even the interest groups. So that's one of the benefits of federalism. Switching gears here to disadvantages. Excuse me, my voice is cracking up. That's what I get for talking so much. Federalism disadvantages. Economic disparities between states as states compete with each other for resources. Some states are resource rich, some states are not. There are things that South Carolina has that Nebraska does not, i.e. an ocean. There are things that California has that North Carolina does not. And there are things that Mississippi does not have that the state of Washington does. So there can be some disparities between states, but the beautiful thing is generally speaking, we're mobile individuals. So if a state's too bad, we can move and not leave the country. That's great. But if you are bound, say the state of Mississippi, you are bound to an underperforming public school system. So there's some economic mobility issues there. Healthcare access, costs, and quality vary among states. There's non-uniformity there. Things like Medicaid. Different states have varying attitudes and sometimes underfund programs like Medicaid, which is state versus national plans like Medicare. So if you live in a state where they don't value that, and you can create, again, an economic disparity, but also a healthcare access problem. Whereas some states kind of go overboard and try to pay for everything, and they're broke. Hello, California, looking at you. How are those rolling blackouts going for you? Man, that should be a resource-rich state, but I digress. Sometimes the checks on national power can limit how fast and how much federal government can assist its local citizens and state governments. Okay, I think of a situation on that last one, like Hurricane Katrina down in New Orleans, down in Louisiana, and Mississippi. Generally speaking, those are poorer states, and they have limited resources. But their local leaders had a poor understanding of how fast the government could respond, and legally how they could respond. Now, there was probably some ineptness at the federal level as well, but there was a slow response to Katrina. Had people, in floodwaters living on the roof of their house, just begging someone to come get them. It was kind of a sad situation, and it clearly illustrated a disadvantage of federalism in that sometimes it takes time for the multiple levels to come together to help. But the beautiful thing is, in that situation, I think if the dual hurricanes, the most recent, dating this lecture a little bit, was Laura hitting Mississippi and more towards Texas and Houston, but still affected places like New Orleans, the response is much quicker today. So federalism being a laboratory, you can learn what not to do. You can learn what to do, and you can learn to do what you do better. So is it perfect? No. But is it better than, say, a dictatorship, an absolute central government power? Yes. Is it better than absolute state rights, where we're absolutely paralyzed because states can't agree on everything and it has to be unanimous, like we had in the Articles of Confederation? I think so. I really do. So that's an overview of Chapter 3, American Federalism. Again, this does not replace the reading. This is like the Cliff's Notes, and that'll get you about a 60 on the quiz if you're not doing the reading as well. So make sure you're doing that as well. Get better every time out. Remember, everything we're looking for in this class, in this life, in every class, every part of our life, is the only person we got to be better than is us yesterday. So I just got to be better than I was yesterday. You got to be better than you were yesterday. That's excellence, man. And we're striving for excellence. Thank you for listening to this lecture. Hope it was helpful. I'll see you soon.